I was sitting in the lawyer's office, staring at a pile of documents that apparently made me a land baron, though I had no idea until 30 minutes ago when Gerald Hutchinson, a state attorney, dropped the news like a bomb. My great-uncle Theodore, a man I'd met exactly twice in my entire life, had died and left me 240 acres in Scottsdale, Arizona. The kicker: there was an entire subdivision built on it, complete with a hyperactive HOA that had no clue they'd been paying ground rent to a man who'd been quietly collecting checks for 40 years. So let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward in the leather chair. Uncle Theodore owned the land, but sold development rights back in 1984. Gerald nodded, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Correct. The developer, Pinnacle Properties, built Sagaro Heights Subdivision between 1984 and 1987. They sold the homes, but your uncle retained ownership of the actual land through a ground lease arrangement. Every homeowner in that subdivision has been paying ground rent, though most probably think it's just part of their HOA dues. How many homes are we talking about? 163 properties. Gerald slid another document across his mahogany desk. The ground lease is valid for 99 years, with rent adjustments every decade based on fair market value. Your uncle was meticulous about the legal structure. Everything is airtight. I picked up the document, scanning the legal jargon that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. And they don't know he died. The property management company that collects the ground rent knew, obviously. They're the ones who contacted me to establish the estate. But the HOA and individual homeowners, Gerald shrugged. They're about to find out. I sent the notification letters yesterday via certified mail. They should arrive today. That's when my phone started ringing. Unknown number with a 480 area code, Arizona. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Different number. Then again. Gerald glanced at my phone, then at me. I'd say they're finding out right about now. By the time I left the lawyer's office in downtown Phoenix, I had 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails. I sat in my rental car in the parking garage and played the first one. This is Brenda Whitmore, president of the Sagaro Heights Homeowners Association. We've received some very disturbing documentation today, and I need to speak with you immediately regarding what I can only assume is a clerical error. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. Her voice had that particular pitch that suggested earliest convenience, meant right this second or face my wrath. I'd dealt with enough customer service nightmares in my previous job to recognize the tone of someone who was used to getting their way through sheer force of entitlement. The second voicemail was from the same woman, 15 minutes later, less polite. Mr. Harrison, this is Brenda Whitmore again. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but I've already contacted our legal counsel. Call me back immediately. I deleted the rest without listening and called Gerald. The HOA president is having a meltdown. Expected, he said calmly. Don't engage with them directly yet. Let me handle the initial communication. Your uncle's lease agreement is ironclad, but they're going to test every angle. In the meantime, you should probably come out to Arizona and see the property. You're going to need to decide what you want to do with it. What are my options? Maintain the status quo and collect the ground rent, which is currently about $42,000 monthly, total, from all properties. Sell your interest to the HOA or a developer. Or, and this is the nuclear option, enforce certain clauses in the lease agreement that your uncle chose not to exercise. What kind of clauses? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Let's just say Theodore was a thorough man who didn't trust developers. There are provisions in there that could make things very interesting. Read the full lease agreement on the plane. I'm emailing you the complete file now." I booked a flight to Phoenix for the next morning and spent that evening in my Minneapolis apartment reading through 40 years of legal documents. My uncle Theodore had been a geology professor who'd bought desert land in the early 1970s for pennies on the dollar. When Scottsdale started expanding eastward in the early 1980s, developers came knocking. Instead of selling outright, Theodore had negotiated a ground lease that gave the developer the right to build and sell homes, but Theodore retained land ownership. Every property owner paid ground rent as part of their monthly dues, and the lease included provisions about property maintenance, architectural standards, and environmental protection. What caught my attention were the penalty clauses. If the HOA failed to maintain certain standards, or if they violated specific environmental provisions Theodore had insisted upon, he had the right to increase rent, impose fines, or in extreme cases, terminate individual ground leases. According to his notes, Theodore had documented numerous violations over the years, but had chosen not to enforce the penalties. He'd been a patient man. I was starting to realize I'd inherited not just land, but a time bomb that had been ticking for 4 decades. The flight to Phoenix was smooth, and I landed in bright desert sunshine that felt aggressive after Minneapolis winter. I picked up another rental car and drove east toward Scottsdale, watching the city sprawl give way to newer developments carved into the desert. Saguaro Heights was about 30 minutes from the airport, a planned community of Spanish-style homes arranged in curved streets around a central clubhouse and pool. The entrance had a guardhouse, unmanned, and a large stone sign announcing the community name with pride. I drove through slowly, taking in the neighborhood. Most homes were well-maintained, 2-story stucco structures with tile roofs and desert landscaping. Some had elaborate rock gardens and mature saguaro cacti. Others had let their yards go native, which actually looked better in this environment. Then I started noticing the violations Theodore had documented. Several homes had enclosed their front courtyards with unpermitted walls. One had installed a massive metal storage shed visible from the street. Another had paved over their entire front yard for extra parking. I found the clubhouse and parked in the visitor section. According to Gerald, the HOA held their regular meeting this evening at 7. It was currently 5:30. I decided to walk the neighborhood and get a feel for what I'd inherited. The development was larger than I'd imagined. Winding streets connected cul-de-sacs, each with its own character. The north section had larger lots with mountain views. The south section backed up to a desert preserve. The central area had smaller, more affordable homes arranged around common areas and parks. It was actually quite nice, the kind of place families would want to live. Then I saw the signs. Dozens of them planted in front yards throughout the subdivision. Save our community in bold red letters. Stop the land grab. Saguaro Heights Residents United. Some had more creative messages like 40 years of home ownership can't be wrong, and we will fight this theft. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. This was going to be worse than I'd thought. At 6:45, I walked into the clubhouse. The main room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table at the front. Every chair was filled and people lined the walls. I counted at least 200 residents, maybe more. The energy in the room was hostile, angry conversations bouncing off the walls. I took a position in the back corner, trying to be inconspicuous. At 7 sharp, a woman in her mid-50s walked to the center of the front table and banged a gavel. She had that particular haircut, the one that says, "I want to speak to your manager without words," blonde with aggressive highlights and styled to defy gravity. Her pantsuit was cream-colored linen, and she wore enough turquoise jewelry to stock a gift shop. This emergency meeting of the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association will now come to order. I'm Brenda Whitmore, HOA President, and I know why you're all here. Yesterday, every homeowner received a letter claiming that our homes are built on land we don't own, and that we're now subject to a ground lease held by some stranger who inherited it from a man none of us ever met. The room erupted in angry shouts. Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. I need order. She waited for the noise to die down. I want everyone to know that the board has already consulted with our attorney, Richard Pemberton, who is here tonight. Richard, can you explain the situation? A man in an expensive suit stood up from the front row. He looked uncomfortable. Thank you, Brenda. I've reviewed the documentation provided by the estate attorney representing Theodore Harrison's heir. Unfortunately, the ground lease appears to be legitimate. When Pinnacle Properties developed this subdivision in the 1980s, they did so under a long-term ground lease rather than purchasing the land outright. This was not uncommon at the time, though it's unusual for such arrangements to persist this long. What does this mean for our homes? Someone shouted. Your homes are yours, Richard said. You own the structures and have the right to occupy the land under the terms of the ground lease. The ground rent you've been paying as part of your HOA dues goes to the landowner. What's changed is simply who receives that payment. Can he kick us out? Another voice called. Not without cause and only under very specific circumstances outlined in the lease agreement. Richard adjusted his glasses. However, I need to be honest with you all. The lease agreement is extremely detailed and includes provisions that could be problematic. Brenda's face tightened. What kind of provisions? Environmental protections, architectural standards, maintenance requirements. There are penalty clauses for violations. The previous landowner apparently chose not to enforce these provisions, but legally the new owner could. The room exploded again. I watched Brenda's face turn red as she hammered the gavel. She was losing control of the meeting. We'll fight this, someone yelled. Class action lawsuit. On what grounds? Richard asked, and his tone suggested he'd already explored this option. The lease is legal. The land ownership is clear. Theodore Harrison bought this land in 1972, and there's an unbroken chain of title. This is extortion. An older man stood up, shaking with rage. We've been paying for 40 years. That land should be ours by now. I decided it was time to make my presence known. I walked down the side aisle toward the front of the room. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. By the time I reached the front table, the entire room was staring at me. Who are you? Brenda demanded. Tyler Harrison. Theodore Harrison's great-nephew and heir. If the room had been angry before, it went nuclear. People jumped to their feet shouting. Brenda's gavel broke from the force of her banging. Richard the lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. I just stood there, waiting for the chaos to subside. Finally, a younger woman near the front held up her hands. Let him talk. We should hear what he has to say. The room gradually quieted, though the hostility was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was on me, most of them filled with anger or fear or both. I know you're all upset, I started. I understand. You thought you owned your land and finding out otherwise is a shock, but I want to be clear about something. I didn't create this situation. My uncle structured this deal 40 years ago, and apparently nobody at Pinnacle Properties explained it clearly to homeowners. That's not my fault. So what do you want? Brenda cut in, her voice sharp. Money. Are you here to bleed us dry? I'm here to understand what I inherited, I said. And from what I can tell, my uncle was extremely patient with this community. He documented violations of the lease agreement for years and never enforced the penalty clauses. He could have made your lives difficult, but he chose not to." "How generous," someone said sarcastically. "Actually, it was," I replied. "Because according to the lease agreement I read on the plane, there are currently 63 properties in violation of architectural standards, 18 in violation of environmental protections, and the HOA itself is in breach of contract for failing to maintain common areas to the specified standards." The room went silent. Brenda's face went pale. "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We maintain this community beautifully. Do you?" I pulled out my phone and brought up the photos I'd taken earlier. "Because I walked around this afternoon and saw unpermitted structures, paved desert landscaping in violation of the water conservation provisions, walls blocking sight lines specified in the architectural standards, and the retention pond near the south entrance is choked with debris and algae. According to the lease, any of these violations can result in fines of $1,000 per day until corrected." Richard the lawyer looked sick. "Brenda, I need to see that lease agreement immediately." "I think we need to talk," Brenda said to me, her tone completely changed. "Privately." I shook my head. "Anything we discuss, the community should hear. Transparency is important." "Fine." She gestured to an empty chair at the board table. "Sit." I sat. The room remained standing. Watching like this was the most important sporting event of their lives. "What do you want?" Brenda asked again, this time with less hostility and more calculation in her voice. "Honestly, I haven't decided. I inherited this 3 days ago. I'm still trying to understand the full situation." "The ground rent is current," she said. "We've never missed a payment." "That's true. But the rent hasn't been adjusted for fair market value in 10 years. According to the lease, that adjustment was due last year. My uncle apparently didn't get around to it before he died." Brenda's jaw tightened. "How much of an increase are we talking about?" "Gerald, my uncle's attorney, had an appraisal done. Based on current Scottsdale land values, the ground rent should increase by approximately 38%. The room erupted again. People were screaming now, genuinely panicked. I understood why. Many of these people were probably on fixed incomes or tight budgets. A sudden 38% increase in what was effectively property tax could push some into financial hardship. "That's insane," a woman yelled. "We can't afford that." "Then maybe you should buy the land," I said calmly. The room went quiet again. Brenda leaned forward. "You'd sell?" "For the right price, sure. I'm not attached to this land. I never even knew I'd inherit it. Make me a reasonable offer and we can work something out." I could see the wheels turning in Brenda's head. "How much?" "Fair market value for 240 acres of developed land in Scottsdale. My uncle's attorney estimates it at around $48 million. Someone actually gasped. Brenda looked like I'd slapped her. "That's nearly $300,000 per household," she sputtered. "That's impossible." "Then I guess we maintain the current arrangement," I said, "with the adjusted ground rent and enforcement of the lease provisions." "This is blackmail," an older man said. "You're trying to force us to pay an outrageous price." "I'm stating what the land is worth," I corrected. "You all live in Scottsdale. You know property values here. Did you really think the land under your homes was worthless?" Richard the lawyer spoke up. "Could we propose a payment plan? The HOA could take out a loan, finance the purchase over time." "That's between you and your lender," I said. "I'm willing to discuss options, but I'm not giving away $48 million worth of land because it's inconvenient for you to acknowledge reality." Brenda stood up abruptly. "We need to caucus as a board. Everyone, please clear the room except board members and Richard." The room erupted in protests, but Brenda was adamant. Slowly, reluctantly, the residents filed out, shooting me looks that ranged from angry to terrified. Within 10 minutes, only the 5 board members, Richard and I, remained. Brenda sat back down, her composure cracking. This is a disaster. We don't have $48 million. Even with a loan, the monthly payments would be astronomical. Then don't buy it, I said. Continue the ground lease. With a 38% increase and strict enforcement of provisions we didn't even know existed. Another board member, a thin man in his 60s, shook his head. That's not sustainable. Why didn't Pinnacle Properties disclose this? The youngest board member, a woman in her 40s, asked, when people bought their homes, shouldn't they have been told about the ground lease? They should have, Richard said. I'd need to review the original purchase contracts, but if Pinnacle Properties failed to properly disclose the ground lease arrangement, there might be liability there. Pinnacle went bankrupt in 2001, Brenda said. I remember because we tried to go after them for construction defects. There's nothing left to sue. We sat in uncomfortable silence. I felt bad for them, genuinely. These were people who'd worked hard, bought homes, built lives. They didn't deserve to have the rug pulled out from under them. But I also wasn't going to pretend I didn't own land worth tens of millions of dollars. Look, I said, I'm not trying to destroy your community, but I'm also not a charity. My uncle structured this deal legally and fairly. The fact that nobody paid attention to the details for 40 years isn't my problem. What if we counter-offer? Brenda asked. Something more reasonable, depends on the number. But understand, I can make more than that by just collecting ground rent over time. How much would the adjusted rent be annually? Richard asked. I did the quick math. About $700,000 per year, total for all properties. That's approximately $430 per property per month, up from $312. Plus enforcement of violations, Richard added grimly. I could be flexible on existing violations, I said. Give people time to come into compliance, but going forward the standards would need to be maintained. Brenda looked at her fellow board members. We need to consult with the community. This is too big a decision for just the board. Agreed, I said. Talk to your people. Get me a proposal. I'll be in town for the next few days. I gave them Gerald's contact information and left the clubhouse. Outside, small groups of residents clustered in the parking lot, talking in urgent, worried tones. Several glared at me as I walked to my car. One older woman actually spit in my direction, though she missed by several feet. I drove back to my hotel in central Scottsdale, a mid-range place near Old Town, and collapsed on the bed. My phone was blowing up with messages from Gerald, from reporters somehow, from angry emails to the address Gerald must have given out. I turned it off and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't how I'd expected this week to go. 3 days ago, I'd been a project manager at a tech company in Minneapolis, living a normal, boring life. Now, I owned land worth tens of millions of dollars and had an entire community that wanted my head on a spike. I woke the next morning to pounding on my hotel room door. For a moment, I thought it was housekeeping, but the aggression of the knocking suggested otherwise. I looked through the peephole and saw Brenda Whitmore, along with 2 other people I didn't recognize. I opened the door. It's 7 in the morning. We need to talk, Brenda said, pushing past me into the room. The 2 others followed, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt and khakis, and a woman about Brenda's age wearing workout clothes and a furious expression. This is Carl Henderson, our treasurer, and Deanne Sutherland, secretary, Brenda said. We've been up all night talking to residents and running numbers. And you decided to ambush me at my hotel. We decided to make you an offer before you do something crazy like enforce all those violation penalties. Brenda sat in the desk chair without being invited. $20 million. The HOA will take out a loan, pay you $20 million for the land. I sat on the edge of the bed. That's less than half what it's worth. It's what we can afford, Carl said. His voice was strained, exhausted. We've talked to 3 banks. With the HOA's current reserves and a loan structured over 30 years, we can manage payments on $20 million. Anything more, and we'd have to levy special assessments that would bankrupt half our residents. Not my problem, I said, though I felt like a jerk saying it. You could ruin lives, Deanne said quietly. Families who have lived here for decades, retirees on fixed incomes, people who saved everything to buy these homes. And I could accept $20 million less than my inheritance is worth because nobody bothered to read the fine print 40 years ago. I shook my head. I'm not a monster, but I'm also not a fool. $30 million, Brenda said. That's our absolute maximum. We'd have to levy a $15,000 special assessment per household immediately and increase monthly dues by $400. It'll be painful but survivable. I considered it. $30 million was still significantly below market value, but it was a substantial amount of money, more than I'd ever imagined having. And it would solve the problem cleanly. Let these people live their lives. I'll think about it, I said. Give me until tomorrow. We need an answer today, Brenda insisted. People are panicking. Some are already talking about selling and moving. Property values are going to crater if this uncertainty continues. Tomorrow, I repeated firmly. This is too big a decision to make before I've had coffee. They left, unhappy but at least hopeful. I called Gerald. $30 million is low, he said immediately when I explained the offer. But it's not insulting. If you want out of this situation cleanly, it's an option. What would you advise? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Tyler, I'm going to tell you something about your uncle. Theodore was a good man, but he was also principled to a fault. He created this ground lease structure because he believed in responsible land use. He included all those environmental and architectural provisions because he loved the desert and wanted to protect it. When Pinnacle Properties started cutting corners, when the HOA started ignoring the standards, he was furious. But he was also tired and old, and fighting seemed pointless. So he just let it slide. He documented everything. Every violation, every breach of contract. I think he believed that someday someone would hold them accountable. Maybe he hoped that someone would be you. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone who just found out they inherited this mess. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't take the $30 million. I'm saying you should understand what you're giving up if you do. Your uncle created something potentially very valuable, not just financially but environmentally. That land was supposed to be protected. If you sell to the HOA, do you think they'll maintain those standards? I hadn't thought about it that way. Probably not. Definitely not. Brenda Whitmore and her board will do the minimum required by county ordinances. They'll pave paradise and put up a parking lot, as the song goes. I spent the rest of the day driving around Scottsdale, looking at other developments, getting a feel for the area. Saguaro Heights was actually one of the nicer communities, but you could see where corners had been cut, where the desert had been pushed back further than necessary, where water was wasted on non-native landscaping that required constant irrigation. I drove out to the desert preserve behind the subdivision and hiked for a few hours, thinking. That evening, I called Brenda and asked her to set up another community meeting. She resisted, saying people were too upset, but I insisted. We scheduled it for the following evening, 7 o'clock again at the clubhouse. The next day, I spent the morning with a land use attorney Gerald had recommended, going through the lease agreement in excruciating detail. She confirmed what I'd suspected. The environmental provisions were actually quite progressive for 1984, and if enforced, would make Sagaro Heights one of the more sustainable communities in the region. The architectural standards were designed to preserve sight lines, maximize natural cooling, and maintain the desert aesthetic. "Your uncle was ahead of his time," she said. "These provisions read like modern green building codes. Can the HOA get around them if they own the land? Some of them might be enforceable through county ordinances or the original CC and Articus, but many would disappear. The ground lease is what gives them teeth." That night, I walked into the clubhouse to an even larger crowd than before. The local news was there, cameras and all. Brenda looked exhausted and angry. The residents looked scared and hostile. This was going to be fun. I took my position at the front table. Brenda banged a new gavel and called for order. "Mr. Harrison has asked to address the community," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm sure we're all eager to hear what he's decided." I stood up and faced the crowd. "I've spent the last 2 days thinking about your offer and learning about this community. I've read through 40 years of documentation my uncle kept. I've walked your streets and hiked the desert behind your homes, and I've come to a decision." The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "I'm not selling." The room exploded. Brenda shot to her feet. "You can't be serious. We offered $30 million. "I'm declining," I said loudly, speaking over the chaos. "But let me explain why." "There's nothing to explain," someone yelled. "You're just greedy." "Actually, I'm not," I said. "If I wanted maximum profit, I'd hold onto the land, collect ground rent, and wait for values to appreciate further. But that's not what I'm going to do either." The room quieted slightly, confusion replacing some of the anger. "My uncle created this ground lease structure to protect the desert and ensure responsible development. For 40 years, you've enjoyed below-market ground rent while ignoring the responsibilities that came with it. That ends now, but not in the way you think." I pulled out a document from my bag. "I've had my attorneys draft a new arrangement. I'm converting the ground lease into a conservation easement structure. The land will be transferred to a land trust I'm establishing with strict environmental protections. The trust will own the land in perpetuity, and you'll continue paying ground rent, but at the current rate, not the increased rate." Brenda looked stunned. "What's the catch?" "The catch is you have to comply with the original lease provisions. The environmental standards, the architectural guidelines, the maintenance requirements, all of it. And the land trust will actively monitor and enforce compliance. Properties in violation have 6 months to come into compliance. After that, the penalty provisions kick in." "That's still expensive for people who have built unpermitted structures or need to replace non-native landscaping," Carl, the treasurer, said. "Which is why the land trust will provide interest-free loans for compliance work, repayable over 5 years. No one will be forced into immediate financial hardship, but everyone will be expected to meet the standards." The room was processing this, the mood shifting from hostile to wary to cautiously optimistic. A younger man in the middle section stood up. "Why would you do this?" "You're giving up millions of dollars." "Not really," I said. "The land trust will generate income from the ground rent, which will fund environmental education programs, desert restoration projects, and community sustainability initiatives. I'll take a reasonable salary as trustee. The rest goes to conservation, and when I'm done with the job, someone else will take over. This becomes bigger than me, bigger than any of us." An older woman near the front, one who'd been crying during the previous meeting, raised her hand. "What about people who can't afford even the interest-free loans? Some of us are on very fixed incomes." "The trust will have a hardship provision," I said. "For residents who genuinely can't afford compliance work, The trust will cover the costs in exchange for a conservation easement on their individual property. Essentially, you agree to maintain the standards permanently, and the trust pays for the necessary work. This sounds too good to be true, Brenda said suspiciously. What do you really get out of this? A clear conscience, I said. And a salary of $75,000 a year as trustee, which is fair compensation for the work involved. But mainly, I get to honor what my uncle actually wanted. He didn't create this structure to get rich. He did it to protect the desert. Now I can finish what he started. Richard, the lawyer, spoke up. I'd need to review the trust documents, but if structured properly, this could actually work. The community maintains control over their homes and daily governance, but the land itself is protected. Exactly, I said. The HOA continues to operate as it always has. You elect your board, manage your common areas, collect dues. The only change is that you're accountable to the environmental and architectural standards my uncle established. And honestly, those standards will make this a more desirable community. Property values will likely increase. The mood in the room was shifting. People were talking to each other, animated but no longer angry. Brenda still looked suspicious, but even she seemed to recognize this was better than the alternatives. Can we have time to review the trust documents? She asked. Of course. I'll have copies delivered tomorrow. Schedule a community vote for 2 weeks from now. If the majority of homeowners accept these terms, we move forward. If not, I'll sell the land to a commercial developer and you can all deal with that. That got their attention. The threat of a commercial developer buying the land and potentially redeveloping was worse than any scenario I'd presented. That's manipulative, Deanne said. That's realistic, I corrected. These are your options. Choose wisely. The meeting broke up with much less hostility than it had started with. People actually approached me afterward, shaking my hand, thanking me for not taking the nuclear option. Brenda kept her distance, but she didn't look quite so murderous anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Gerald and the land use attorney to finalize the trust documents. We established the Saguaro Heights Land Trust as a 501c3 nonprofit with a board of directors that included 2 community representatives, 2 environmental experts, 1 Scottsdale city official, and me as the founding trustee. The ground rent would continue at current rates, adjusted only for inflation, not fair market value. The trust would actively monitor compliance with environmental standards and provide support for residents to come into compliance. The community vote was scheduled for a Saturday morning. I flew back to Phoenix the night before, nervous about the outcome. If they voted no, I'd have to follow through on my threat to sell to a commercial developer, and I really didn't want to do that. The voting took place at the clubhouse from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Every homeowner got 1 vote. Gerald and I waited in my hotel, refreshing email every 5 minutes, waiting for the results. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Richard, the lawyer. You got 73% approval, he said. It passed. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Really? Brenda voted against it along with about 40 other households, but the majority recognized this was the best option available. Congratulations, you're now a land trust trustee. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. I quit my job in Minneapolis and moved to Scottsdale full-time, renting a small house near Old Town while I figured out longer-term plans. The land trust office was established in a small commercial space near the subdivision, and I hired 2 staff members, an environmental compliance officer and an administrative coordinator. We conducted property-by-property assessments, documenting violations, and working with homeowners to develop compliance plans. Some of the violations were minor and easily fixed. Others required significant work. A man named Doug Palmer had built an entire guest house in his backyard without permits, in direct violation of the density provisions. He was furious when we told him it had to come down, but the lease was clear. After threatening to sue and making my life miserable for 6 weeks, he eventually complied, and we helped him design a permittable casita that met the standards. Brenda Whitmore remained a thorn in my side. She challenged every decision, questioned every assessment, and encouraged other homeowners to push back against the trust's authority. 3 months into the new arrangement, she organized a recall petition to remove the 2 community representatives from the trust board, claiming they were too friendly with me. The recall failed, but barely. The community was divided between people who appreciated the environmental focus and those who resented any restrictions on what they could do with their properties. Then, things took a darker turn. 6 months into the trust's operation, I started noticing irregularities in the HOA's financial reports. As landowner through the trust, I had the right to review certain HOA documents to ensure they were meeting their maintenance obligations. The numbers weren't adding up. Ground rent payments were current, but the HOA's maintenance budget seemed inflated. I asked my administrative coordinator, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison, to dig deeper. The HOA is paying significantly above market rate for landscaping services, Patricia reported a week later. And the vendor, Desert Bloom Landscaping, is owned by Brenda Whitmore's husband. That's a conflict of interest, I said. Is it illegal? Depends on whether it was properly disclosed. Let me check the HOA bylaws and meeting minutes. She came back the next day with more bad news. There's no disclosure in any of the meeting minutes. And get this, Desert Bloom was created 2 years ago, right after Brenda became HOA president. Before that, the HOA used a different landscaping company at half the cost. I called Richard the lawyer. This sounds like embezzlement. It could be, he said carefully. But you'd need to prove that Brenda intentionally hid the conflict of interest and that the HOA is paying inflated prices specifically to benefit her family. That's a high bar. What if I can prove it? Then you'd report it to the Arizona Attorney General's office. HOA fraud is taken seriously here, especially when it involves board members self-dealing. I authorized Patricia to do a full forensic review of the HOA's finances for the past 3 years. What she found was damning. Desert Bloom Landscaping had received over $400,000 from the HOA for services that comparable companies would have provided for $200,000. Additionally, Brenda had approved a consulting fee of $1,500 monthly to her own personal LLC for administrative services that no one could actually define. I took the evidence to Richard first. He reviewed it and whistled low. This is worse than I thought. She's been systematically looting the HOA. What's our next move? We have 2 options. Report it to the Attorney General and let them handle it criminally. Or we present this to the HOA board and demand Brenda's resignation and full restitution. The first option is more satisfying but harder on the community. The second option is cleaner but lets her off easier. She's stolen from her neighbors for years, I said. I'm not letting that slide. We scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting and invited the other 4 board members, explicitly excluding Brenda. When they arrived at the Land Trust office and saw the spreadsheets and documentation Patricia had prepared, their faces went white. I had no idea, Carl Henderson, the treasurer, said. He looked sick. She handles all the vendor contracts. I just review the aggregate numbers. That's the problem, Richard said. There weren't adequate checks and balances. Brenda exploited that. What happens now? Deanne Sutherland asked quietly. We're reporting this to the Arizona Attorney General, I said. I wanted you to know first as board members. You'll probably be questioned as part of the investigation. Will we be liable? The fourth board member, a nervous man named Tom Berkeley, asked. Only if you were complicit, Richard said. If you genuinely didn't know, you should be fine, but you'll need to cooperate fully with investigators. The investigation moved quickly. The Attorney General's office took white-collar crime seriously, and when presented with clear evidence of HOA fraud, they acted fast. 2 weeks later, 2 investigators showed up at Brenda's house with a warrant. They seized financial records, computers, and phones. Brenda lawyered up immediately, denying everything. The community was in shock. Many residents had liked Brenda, thought she was a dedicated volunteer who cared about the neighborhood. Others said they'd always suspected something was off. The local news covered the story extensively. HOA president accused of embezzling hundreds of thousands was the headline. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with reporters wanting comments. I declined to speak to media, referring everyone to the Attorney General's office. But privately, I was furious. Brenda had fought me every step of the way, positioned herself as the defender of homeowners against my supposedly greedy land grab, all while stealing from those same homeowners. The trial took 8 months to get to court. In the meantime, the HOA held emergency elections and installed a new board. Carl Henderson stayed on as treasurer, determined to rebuild trust and implement better financial controls. The new president was a retired accountant named Margaret Foster, who took the job with grim determination to clean up the mess. When the trial finally happened, I attended every day of the proceedings. Brenda's defense was that the payments to Desert Bloom were fair market rates, and that her consulting fees were legitimate compensation for extra work she did beyond her duties as president. The prosecution shredded that argument with expert testimony and comparable pricing analysis. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and returned guilty verdicts on 6 counts of fraud and 2 counts of theft. Brenda Whitmore was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $450,000 to the HOA. Her husband, who'd claimed ignorance about the inflated contracts, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and received probation. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it was an ugly situation all around. A community had been betrayed by someone they'd trusted with leadership. Margaret Foster approached me on the courthouse steps. "Thank you," she said simply. "If you hadn't pushed for transparency and reviewed those finances, this could have gone on for years." "Just doing what needed to be done," I said. "The community is starting to appreciate what you're doing with the land trust," she said. "Property values are up 15% since you implemented the environmental standards. Buyers specifically seek out Saguaro Heights now because of the sustainability reputation." That was gratifying to hear. Over the following year, the land trust hit its stride. We established a native plant nursery that provided free desert-appropriate landscaping to homeowners, replacing non-native plants. We created an educational program for Scottsdale schools about desert ecology and responsible land use. We hired a part-time naturalist who led monthly desert hikes for residents. The compliance rate improved dramatically. Most homeowners genuinely wanted to do the right thing once they understood the environmental reasoning behind the standards. The few holdouts who resisted were brought into compliance through a combination of education, financial assistance, and when necessary, penalty enforcement. One particularly stubborn resident, a man named Frank Delgado who'd paved his entire front yard for RV parking, refused to comply with the landscaping requirements. We sent notices, offered assistance, and explained the environmental impact of impermeable surfaces in the desert. He ignored everything. Finally, we imposed the $1,000 per day penalty specified in the lease. After 3 weeks and $21,000 in accumulated fines, Frank hired a lawyer and threatened to sue. His lawyer reviewed the lease agreement and advised him to comply. The RV parking was removed, native landscaping was installed, and Frank became one of the trust's most vocal supporters after he realized how much cooler. His house stayed with proper desert landscaping, instead of heat-absorbing asphalt. 2 years after I'd inherited the land, Saguaro Heights had transformed into a model sustainable community. The Arizona Republic ran a feature story about the land trust and the environmental protections we'd implemented. National environmental organizations cited us as an example of innovative conservation strategies. Property values had increased 30%, making the community one of the most desirable in Scottsdale. I stood in the desert preserve behind the subdivision one evening, watching the sunset paint the saguaro cacti in shades of gold and orange. Theodore's vision had been ahead of its time, but now it was reality. The land was protected, the community was thriving, and the desert was preserved for future generations. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Another developer just inquired about replicating the land trust model for a new subdivision near Fountain Hills. Interested? I smiled and typed back. Set up a meeting. Maybe Uncle Theodore had known exactly what he was doing when he structured that ground lease 40 years ago. And maybe inheriting this complicated, messy, wonderful responsibility was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'd come to Arizona expecting a simple real estate transaction, and instead found a purpose. The land had given me that, and I was going to spend the rest of my career protecting it, one subdivision at a time. The Saguaro Heights Land Trust Board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I had proposals for expanding our educational programs and possibly acquiring adjacent parcels to extend the desert preserve. Margaret Foster had suggested creating a documentary about the community's transformation to inspire other HOAs to adopt sustainable practices. As I walked back toward my car, I passed several residents out for evening walks. They waved and smiled, a far cry from the hostility of that first community meeting. An older couple, the Hendersons, stopped to chat about the hawk nesting in the saguaro near their property. A young family asked about adding solar panels to their roof, wanting to make sure they complied with the architectural standards. This was what community looked like when people worked together instead of against each other, when environmental responsibility aligned with property values, when long-term thinking replaced short-term convenience. I thought about Brenda Whitmore sometimes, serving her prison sentence. She'd been so focused on personal gain that she'd missed the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. The community she'd claimed to protect was now thriving specifically because her exploitation had been stopped. Gerald called as I was driving home. I have the final accounting on Theodore's estate. Everything is settled, transferred to the trust, legally airtight. Your uncle would be proud of what you've done. I hope so, I said. I wish I'd known him better. He was a quiet man but principled. He spent his career teaching geology, helping students understand the desert ecosystem. This land was his retirement project, his way of ensuring at least one piece of desert would be protected properly. You've turned it into something even bigger than he imagined. After we hung up, I thought about legacy and responsibility. Most people inherit money or possessions, simple things that can be spent or sold. I'd inherited an ideal, a vision for how humans could live alongside nature instead of destroying it. That inheritance came with complications and challenges, but it also came with purpose. The land trust was now financially sustainable, with the ground rent providing steady income and grants from environmental organizations supplementing our programs. We'd established partnerships with Arizona State University for desert ecology research, and with local tribes to incorporate traditional land management practices into our conservation work. 6 months later, we broke ground on the Fountain Hills project, a new sustainable subdivision designed from the ground up with the lessons we'd learned at Saguaro Heights. This time, buyers would know exactly what they were getting into. The environmental standards would be baked into every purchase agreement, and the land trust would own the property from day one. The model was replicable, and inquiries kept coming in from developers and communities across Arizona and neighboring states. What had started as an inherited mess was becoming a movement toward more responsible desert development. I hired additional staff to handle the growing workload. The Land Trust Office moved to a larger space, and we established an internship program for college students studying environmental science and land use planning. Theodore's vision was expanding beyond anything he could have imagined. Standing at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Fountain Hills project, surrounded by environmental advocates, city officials, and excited future homeowners, I felt the weight of what we'd accomplished. 3 years ago, I'd been a tech project manager with no particular connection to Arizona or environmental conservation. Now, I was pioneering a new model for sustainable development, protecting desert ecosystems while proving that conservation and community could coexist. The local news interviewed me for the evening broadcast. What would you say to other communities facing similar challenges balancing development and environmental protection? The reporter asked. That they're not actually opposing forces, I said. Good environmental stewardship increases property values and quality of life. It requires long-term thinking and some upfront investment, but the returns are worth it. We've proven that at Saguaro Heights, and we'll prove it again here. That evening, I drove back through Saguaro Heights, taking the long route through the winding streets. The community looked beautiful in the fading light, homes nestled into the desert landscape rather than imposed upon it. Native plants bloomed in yards, creating habitat for birds and pollinators. Solar panels gleamed on many roofs. The retention pond sparkled, clean and properly maintained, serving its function while providing a small oasis for wildlife. This was Uncle Theodore's legacy, and now it was mine too. The land had been entrusted to my care, and I'd risen to meet that responsibility. Not with the anger and resentment the community had initially feared, but with respect for what the land needed and what the people deserved. We'd found a way forward together, through conflict and compromise, to create something worth preserving. The Saguaro Heights Land Trust would continue its work long after I was gone, protecting this piece of desert in perpetuity. Other communities would follow the model, creating a network of sustainably developed lands across the Southwest. Theodore had planted the seed 40 years ago, and I'd helped it grow into something remarkable. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt at peace with the inheritance I'd received and the responsibility I'd accepted. The land with an entire subdivision on it was no longer a burden or a conflict. It was a purpose, a calling, and a legacy I was proud to carry forward.